Daniel Marsh signed his name on the last page of a settlement he did not have to sign, slid it across the mahogany table, and stood to leave with a single canvas duffel bag and the clothes he was wearing. The Whitfield family watched him walk out of the house they had never once let him call his own. They thought that was the end of him. They did not know that in 9 days, a line of black vehicles carrying diplomatic flags would turn slowly onto Beaumont Lane, stop outside that same house, and change every one of their lives. This is the story of what patience costs and what it eventually buys. If stories about quiet dignity, outlasting loud cruelty, move you the way they move me, take a second right now to hit that like button and subscribe, because these narratives take a long time to tell properly, and your support keeps them coming. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to a man who learned early that the loudest people in a room are almost never the strongest. Daniel Marsh had married Claire Whitfield 11 years earlier when he was 31 and she was 29 in a small ceremony that her family attended, the way one attends a mildly disappointing event out of obligation. He had been, at the time, a structural consultant working out of a rented office with 2 employees and a lot of unpaid invoices. The Whitfields ran a mid-sized regional development firm, Whitfield Grove Properties, and to them a man who calculated load-bearing tolerances for other people's buildings was a technician, a hired hand, someone who existed a full tier below the people who owned the land those buildings sat upon. Harold Whitfield, Claire's father, had shaken Daniel's hand at the wedding with the enthusiasm of a man handling a wet umbrella. For 11 years, Daniel had endured a slow, patient erosion. It was never a single blow. It was the accumulation of 10,000 small ones. At every family dinner, Harold would ask Daniel how the little consulting thing was coming along. Always the little consulting thing, always with a smile that invited the table to smile with him. Claire's brother Vincent, 3 years younger than Daniel, and installed as vice president of the family firm before he had ever finished a project on his own, treated Daniel as a kind of resident handyman, calling him at odd hours to ask whether a wall could be moved, then taking the advice to a licensed firm and paying them for it, while Daniel got nothing but the satisfaction of being useful to people who despised him. Claire's mother, Margaret, was the quietest cruelty of them all. She never insulted Daniel directly. She simply spoke of him in the third person, while he sat at the table, addressing Claire as though her husband were a piece of furniture that had unfortunately been left in the room. Daniel, over the years, learned to hold his fork a certain way, learned to answer questions no one had quite asked him, learned to smile at a ceiling that was slowly lowering onto his head. And through all of it, the person who should have stood beside him did not. Claire loved him in the exhausted, apologetic way of someone who had spent her whole life being told that her family's approval was oxygen. When Harold made his jokes, Claire looked at her plate. When Vincent condescended, Claire changed the subject. When Margaret erased Daniel from the conversation, Claire squeezed his knee under the table, as if that small pressure could substitute for the words she never found the courage to say aloud. Daniel had married a woman he loved, and a silence he could not forgive. And for 11 years he had told himself the love was enough to carry the silence. What none of the Whitfields understood, because it never occurred to any of them to look, was that the little consulting thing had not stayed little. Daniel Marsh had spent those 11 years doing something the Whitfields, for all their bluster about property and legacy, had never learned to do. He had built something real, slowly, without announcing it, without borrowing his father-in-law's money, and without needing anyone's permission. His firm, which he had never renamed after himself out of a habit of modesty that the Whitfields mistook for smallness, had by the 10th year become one of the most trusted structural engineering consultancies in the entire region. It held the analysis contracts for 2 hospital expansions, a transit hub, and a stadium retrofit. And in the last 2 years, it had done something that no member of the Whitfield family could have imagined a man who wore off-the-rack suits was capable of. It had won the structural certification and safety integrity contract for a new international consular and trade complex, a project financed jointly by a foreign government and a national infrastructure fund, a project whose success or failure sat, quite literally, on Daniel Marsh's signature. He had kept it separate, not out of deception, but out of self-protection. Early in the marriage, he had tried to share a win with the family, a modest one, a bridge inspection contract he had been proud of, and Harold had waved it away and asked whether Daniel had considered that real men build the bridges rather than checking somebody else's math. Something in Daniel had closed like a door that evening, quietly and permanently. From then on, his professional life became a country the Whitfields were never issued a visa to enter. Claire knew a portion of it. She knew he was doing well. She did not know, because she had never truly asked, and he had stopped volunteering exactly how well. The distance between what she assumed and what was true had grown into a canyon, and neither of them had looked over the edge in a very long time. The break came on a Sunday in October at the house on Beaumont Lane, a house the family always referred to as ours, even though Daniel and Claire had lived in it for 6 years, and Daniel had personally paid off the remaining mortgage 2 years earlier with money the family did not know he had. The Whitfields had gathered for what Margaret called a family conversation, which in that household was code for an ambush arranged in advance and staged for maximum effect. Daniel walked into his own living room to find Harold seated in the center of the sofa like a magistrate, Vincent standing by the window with his arms folded, Margaret perched with a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking, and Claire near the doorway to the kitchen, unable to meet his eyes. There was a folder on the coffee table. Daniel recognized the particular quality of the silence. It was the silence of people who had already decided something and were now performing the ceremony of pretending to decide it in front of him. Harold began, as Harold always did, with a preamble about family and honesty and the difficult things that had to be said. Then he said them. The firm Whitfield Grove was in trouble. Not that Harold used the word trouble. He used phrases like a temporary compression of liquidity and a repositioning of assets. Vincent, it emerged over the next 20 minutes, had over-leveraged the company on a luxury development that had stalled, and the family needed to consolidate. They needed the house on Beaumont Lane. They had always considered it a family asset, Harold explained, because the down payment 11 years ago had come in part from a gift Harold had made at the wedding. A gift Daniel remembered as $30,000 offered publicly and reminded of privately at least once a year since. What Harold was proposing, wrapped in the language of family unity, was that Daniel sign the house over. There was a document in the folder. Margaret had already spoken to a lawyer. The house, they had determined among themselves, morally belonged to the Whitfields, and Daniel, who had after all only married into the family, who had never really been one of them, should understand that when a family faces hardship, the people on the edges make room for the people at the center. Daniel listened to all of it without a word. He watched Vincent's jaw work with the particular arrogance of a man who has never once been told no. He watched Margaret's small, satisfied nods. He watched Harold build his case brick by self-righteous brick. And most of all, he watched Claire standing in the doorway, saying nothing, her hands twisting the hem of her cardigan, her eyes fixed on a point on the floor midway between her husband and her father, choosing, in her silence, the side she had always chosen. When Harold finished, he set his hands on his knees and asked, in a tone of enormous generosity, whether Daniel understood. Daniel said that he understood perfectly. He reached forward and picked up the document. He read it, slowly, all 4 pages, while the room grew tighter around him. It was a quitclaim deed, transferring his interest in the property, accompanied by a mutual release. He noted, with the same cold clarity he brought to a stress analysis, that the document contained no provision requiring the family to repay the mortgage he had personally cleared. no acknowledgement of the improvements he had funded, nothing at all that recognized him as anything but an inconvenience being tidied away. It was, in its own way, an honest document. It said exactly what the Whitfields thought of him. He asked one question. He asked Claire, quietly, looking directly at her for the first time since he entered the room, whether this was what she wanted. The room held its breath. This was the moment 11 years had been building toward, and everyone in it sensed it, even Vincent. Claire lifted her eyes at last and looked at her husband, and Daniel saw in them everything he had always seen: the love, the fear, the apology, and the same fatal inability to place herself between him and her family. She opened her mouth, and what came out was not a defense. It was, God forgive her, a plea for reasonableness. She said, "Daniel, they're my family, and we can find somewhere else, and it's just a house. It's just a house." Daniel would remember that sentence for a long time, not because it was cruel. Claire was not cruel, but because it revealed, with surgical precision, that after 11 years she still did not know who she had married, and worse, that she had never troubled herself to find out. She thought he needed the house. She thought losing it would break him. She had spent over a decade beside a man and understood so little of him that she believed his dignity lived in the deed to a building. Daniel set the document down. He walked past all of them up the stairs into the bedroom and returned 5 minutes later carrying a single canvas duffel bag into which he had placed a few days of clothes, his passport, a laptop, and a leather folio he took from the locked drawer of his desk. He did not slam anything. He did not raise his voice. He picked up the pen from the coffee table, uncapped it, and, in front of all of them, signed the quitclaim deed on the last page. Then he capped the pen and set it down with a soft click. Harold, caught off guard by how easy it had been, actually smiled. Vincent unfolded his arms. Margaret exhaled through her nose in something like triumph. They had won, and they knew it, and their relief made them careless. Vincent could not help himself as Daniel picked up his bag. Vincent said, with a little laugh, that he hoped Daniel had somewhere to stay, because the little consulting thing probably didn't come with a company apartment. Daniel stopped at the door. He turned, and for one moment, the mask of patient endurance he had worn for 11 years slipped, and what was underneath was not anger. It was something far quieter and far more frightening to anyone paying attention, which none of them were. It was certainty. He looked at the four of them, at the folder, at the house, at his wife standing among the people she had chosen, and he said only this. He said, "You've spent 11 years deciding who I am. In about 9 days, you're going to find out." Then he walked out, put his bag in the trunk of a car that was, unremarkably, a 5-year-old sedan, and drove away from Beaumont Lane. The Whitfields stood in the living room they had just seized and felt, for a moment, the smallest flicker of unease. Then Harold clapped his hands together and said something about ordering dinner, and the moment passed, and they congratulated themselves, and they forgot the thing Daniel had said almost immediately, the way people forget a warning they do not believe applies to them. Daniel drove for 40 minutes to a building downtown, a clean glass tower he owned a controlling stake in through his firm, and rode the elevator to a corner apartment on the 14th floor that his company maintained for visiting engineers and clients. He let himself in, set the duffel bag on the bed, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window, looking out over the city he had quietly helped to hold up for 11 years. He did not feel triumphant. He felt tired and sad and clear. He took the leather folio out of his bag and opened it on the small dining table. Inside were the things the Whitfields had never seen because they had never once imagined they needed to look. There was the deed of trust, showing that the Beaumont Lane mortgage had been discharged in full 2 years prior, paid from Daniel's own accounts, a fact that made the quitclaim he had just signed considerably more complicated than the Whitfields understood. Because a mutual release does not erase a documented debt when the paperwork was drafted by people who had no idea the debt existed. There were the incorporation documents for his firm, showing its true valuation. And there was the reason for the number 9. 9 days from that Sunday, the International Consular and Trade Complex Daniel's firm had certified was scheduled for its formal opening and handover ceremony. It was one of the most significant public projects the region had seen in a generation, financed by the government of a foreign partner nation and a national infrastructure fund, and its structural integrity certification, the single document that legally permitted the building to open to the public, bore the seal of Daniel Marsh's firm and Daniel Marsh's personal signature as the certifying principal engineer. The opening was to be attended by the visiting ambassador of the partner nation, by ministers, by the press, and by long-standing protocol. The principal engineer whose certification made the opening possible was to be received as a guest of honor, escorted to the ceremony by the official delegation. Daniel had known this date for over a year. He had not, when he walked into that living room, planned to weaponize it. He had, in fact, intended to invite Claire to finally show her the country he had built, to say, "This is who I am. This is what your family never bothered to see." He had bought a second seat at the ceremony months ago. He had imagined her pride. He had imagined, foolishly, that seeing it might change something. Instead, he had watched her say, "It's just a house." And so the invitation he had meant as a gift became something else, not revenge. Exactly. Daniel was not a man built for revenge. But truth has a weight of its own, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people who refuse to see is to make the truth impossible to look away from. The days that followed were quiet, and the quiet was the strangest part. Daniel went to his office. He reviewed the final structural checks on the complex. He spoke to the delegation's protocol officer about the handover ceremony. He answered a single text from Claire, sent 2 days after he left, that read only, "Where are you staying? Are you okay?" He replied that he was fine and that they would need to speak soon about a number of financial matters, and he left it at that. She did not know how to read that message. She read it as a husband being cold. She did not understand. It was a professional courtesy from a man who had already handed the situation to his attorney. Because Daniel, before anything else, had called his lawyer a careful and unhurried woman named Priya Anand, who had handled his firm's affairs for 8 years, and who listened to the entire story of the Sunday ambush without a single interruption. When he finished, she asked him 3 questions. She asked whether the mortgage discharge was documented and recorded. He said it was. She asked whether the improvements to the property, the extensive ones, the new foundation waterproofing, and the structural reinforcement he had personally engineered and paid contractors to install, were documented with receipts and permits. He said they were, meticulously, and she asked whether he had signed the quitclaim under any threat or duress. He said no. He had signed it freely and calmly, and in front of witnesses. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Daniel appreciated for its honesty. She said, "Daniel, they think they took a house from you. What they actually did was sign a document acknowledging you had an interest to release in front of witnesses, while sitting in a property against which you hold a documented, recorded, unpaid debt of the entire purchase mortgage. The house is not the asset here. The debt is, and the release they drafted covers claims arising from the marriage. It does not cover a recorded lender's interest because they didn't know one existed to cover. In trying to strip you, they've handed you a creditor's claim on the property that is senior to their ownership of it. This is, I want to be clear, the single, most self-inflicted legal wound I have seen in some time." Daniel had known most of this already. He was, after all, a man who spent his life understanding how structures fail. But hearing it from Priya settled something. He told her he did not want to move immediately. He told her to prepare everything, to have it ready, but to hold. He wanted, he said, to give Claire one chance to become the person he had once believed she could be. Priya, who had met Claire twice and formed her own private opinion, said only that she would have the papers ready whenever he called. On Beaumont Lane, meanwhile, the Whitfields were busy, and Harold had moved decisively to make the house a family asset. In fact, as well as in the fiction he had told himself, he and Margaret began the process of listing it, because the plan, it turned out, had never been for Daniel and Claire to live there. The plan had been to sell the house and inject the proceeds into Whitfield Grove to cover Vincent's failed development. Claire learned this 3 days after Daniel left, and it landed on her like cold water. She had signed away her home. She had abandoned her husband in his own living room. She had said, "It's just a house," believing her family would keep it, believing there was some version of this where everyone stayed and only Daniel's feelings had to be sacrificed. And now her mother was interviewing real estate agents at the kitchen table. Claire began, for the first time in 11 years, to see the shape of the thing she had been living inside. She saw how easily her family had used her. She saw that her silence had never bought her safety, only complicity, and she began, too late and imperfectly, to wonder about the last thing her husband had said before he walked out the door. "In 9 days you're going to find out." She counted. She did not know what she was counting toward, but she felt, in the pit of her stomach, the first cold pull of a tide going out before a wave. She tried to reach Daniel. She called. He did not answer. She drove past his office once and did not have the courage to go in. She lay awake in a bed, in a house that was no longer hers, in a family that had never really been his, and she understood, finally, what the phrase, "it's just a house," had done to the man she loved. She understood it was never about the house, it was about being seen, and she had refused, at the one moment it mattered most, to see him. On the 8th day, something small happened that the Whitfields dismissed, and that Claire could not. A courier arrived at Beaumont Lane with a heavy envelope addressed to Daniel Marsh, care of the property, Harold, in the entitled way of a man who now considered everything in the house his, opened it. Inside was formal correspondence on the letterhead of the Office of Protocol for the visiting delegation of the partner nation, confirming arrangements for the reception of the principal certifying engineer at the handover ceremony the following day, and confirming the honor guard escort and the timing of the delegation's arrival. Harold read it twice, frowning. He did not understand what it was. He assumed it was some clerical error, some junk correspondence, some grandiosity attached to Daniel's little consulting thing. He tossed it on the hall table and forgot it. Claire picked it up an hour later, read it in the fading light of the hallway, and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Principal, certifying engineer, honor guard escort, handover ceremony. Everyone in the region knew the complex. It had been in the news for a year. She sat down on the bottom stair and understood at last the size of the thing she had failed to see. The 9th day arrived, clear and bright. Sesh. The handover ceremony for the International Consular and Trade Complex began at 11 in the morning, and Daniel Marsh was received exactly as protocol dictated as the principal engineer whose certification had made the day possible. He stood on the steps of a building he had ensured would not fall down, and the visiting ambassador of the partner nation shook his hand warmly and spoke of the extraordinary rigor of his work, and the minister thanked him publicly from a podium, and the cameras recorded it. And, for the length of an afternoon, Daniel Marsh was exactly what he had always been and never been allowed to be, in front of the people who mattered least and had judged him most. He wore the same kind of off-the-rack suit that Harold had smirked at for 11 years. It did not matter. The people around him were not looking at his suit. They were looking at the man whose signature they had trusted with a building full of lives. At the close of the ceremony, the delegation offered, as a courtesy to their guest of honor, to escort him to a location of his choosing for a private acknowledgement the following day. A small tradition of the partner nation in which the honored engineer's family home is formally visited to pay respects. Daniel, who had planned nothing and everything, gave them an address. He gave them the address on Beaumont Lane. He gave it, he told himself, because it was still, legally and in the most inconvenient way possible for the Whitfields, the address associated with his name and his recorded interest. He did not phrase it as revenge, even in his own mind. But he knew what it would look like. He knew exactly what it would look like. And so, in the early afternoon of the 10th day, a convoy turned onto Beaumont Lane. It came slowly, which somehow made it worse for the people watching from behind the curtains. 3 long black vehicles, polished to a mirror shine, each bearing the small crossed flags of the partner nation and the host state on the front fenders, the fabric snapping crisply in the autumn air. Motorcycle outriders in dress uniform preceded them, and the neighbors of Beaumont Lane, a street of comfortable homes owned by comfortable people, came out onto their porches and their lawns to watch, because nothing like this had ever happened on their street and never would again. The convoy slowed, and slowed further, and came to a stop directly outside the house that Harold Whitfield had taken 9 days earlier, because he believed his son-in-law was a technician, a hired hand, a man who existed a tier below the people who owned the land. Inside the house, the Whitfields crowded to the front window. Harold's face had gone the color of paper. Vincent, who had laughed about the company apartment, said nothing at all. Margaret's teacup, for once, was still. And Claire stood behind them all, one hand pressed to her mouth, because she alone had read the letter, and she alone had understood, and she had spent a sleepless night, trying and failing to reach a husband who was, at that very moment, stepping out of the lead vehicle onto the curb of the home she had helped to take from him. Daniel wore the same off-the-rack suit. Beside him came the ambassador's protocol officer, a poised woman carrying a folio, and behind them 2 members of the honor guard. The doors of the other vehicles opened, and out stepped the ambassador himself, and a deputy minister, and 2 members of the press, who had been permitted to document the courtesy visit. They walked unhurried up the path of the house on Beaumont Lane, and the whole street watched, and the Whitfields watched, and no one moved to open the door. It was Claire who finally opened it. She stepped out onto her own porch, and she was crying. And Daniel looked at her, the way you look at someone you have loved for a very long time and no longer know how to reach. The protocol officer, unaware of any of the human wreckage arranged behind that door, addressed the household with warm formality. She explained that she came on behalf of the delegation to pay respects to the family of the distinguished engineer whose work had honored both nations, and she asked courteously whether they might come in. What followed was the most excruciating 30 minutes of the Whitfield family's collective life. Harold, who had spent 11 years never learning Daniel's title, now had to stand in his own seized living room in front of an ambassador and pretend to be the proud father-in-law of the guest of honor. Margaret, who had spoken of Daniel in the third person as though he were furniture, now had to serve tea to a deputy minister and listen to that minister describe her son-in-law as one of the most respected structural engineers the region had produced. Vincent, who ran a firm now quietly collapsing under a debt he had created, had to shake the hand of an ambassador and hear his own family's home praised as a fitting place for a man of such distinction to live. Every insult of 11 years came back into that room, inverted and hung in the air, and the Whitfields could do nothing but smile and nod and drown in it, and Daniel, throughout, said very little. He accepted the honors with grace. He answered questions about the project, his quiet competence. And when the ambassador remarked in passing what a lovely family home it was, Daniel looked slowly around the living room where 9 days earlier he had signed away his interest in front of these same people, and he said simply that yes, he had built a great deal of himself in this house and that he expected it would soon be settling into a new chapter. Only Claire and only Priya Anand, had she been present, could have understood the full weight of that sentence. The delegation left as it had come, slowly, the flags snapping, the neighbors still watching. And when the last black vehicle rounded the corner and the sound of the motorcycles faded, the house on Beaumont Lane was left in a silence heavier than any it had ever known. Harold turned from the window and looked at his son-in-law, who had lingered behind the delegation. And for the first time in 11 years, Harold Whitfield had no preamble, no joke, no phrase, like a temporary compression of liquidity. He simply stared at Daniel as though seeing him for the first time, which, in every way that mattered, he was. Daniel set his teacup down, and then, in the same calm voice he had used to say, "In 9 days you're going to find out," he told them the rest. He told them that the mortgage on this house, the one they believed they had taken free and clear, had been paid off in full 2 years earlier by him from his own accounts, and that the discharge was recorded, and that the money he had paid remained a documented debt against the property. He told them that the quitclaim they had so carefully drafted released marital claims, but did not and could not extinguish a recorded lender's interest they had never known existed, because a release cannot cover a debt the drafters did not know to name. He told them that his attorney had prepared the paperwork the day after he left, and that the house they intended to sell to save Vincent's failing development could not be sold clean, because his claim ran senior to their ownership, and that any buyer's title search would surface it in an afternoon. He was not cruel about it. He recited it the way he recited a load calculation, each figure in its place, each number agreeing with every other. 31 when he married, 42 now. But 11 years of the little consulting thing, becoming the firm that certified a building the ambassador of a foreign nation had just thanked him for. 2 years since he had paid off a mortgage they had used against him. 9 days since they told him he was nothing, and now one recorded debt standing between them and the money they needed to survive. Harold sat down heavily. Margaret's hands were shaking. Vincent for once understood a structure that was failing, because it was his own, and Claire stood in the middle of them all, and she looked at her husband, and she said the only true thing she had said in the entire ordeal. She said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know who you were." And Daniel looked at her with a sadness that had no anger left in it, and he said, "You could have known. You never asked. That was the whole marriage, Claire. You never asked." In the weeks that followed, the consequences arranged themselves with a symmetry that felt almost designed. Whitfield Grove Properties, unable to sell the house on Beaumont Lane, free of Daniel's recorded claim, and unable to service Vincent's debt without it, entered a painful restructuring. Harold, who had built a life on the certainty that he sat at the center of every room, spent his evenings on the phone with creditors who did not care about his name. Vincent's title of vice president became a courtesy attached to a company shedding assets. The family that had judged a man by his suit discovered how thin their own foundations had always been. Daniel did not press the debt to ruin them. He was not built for it. Through Priya, he offered the Whitfields a settlement of his own, and it was a fair one, fairer than they had any right to expect. He agreed to release his recorded claim on the house in exchange for a clean, court-recognized dissolution of the marriage and the return, in full, of the mortgage sum he had paid, to be secured against the eventual sale of the property. It was not generous in the way weak people mistake for kindness. It was generous in the way strong people can afford to be. It let the Whitfields survive. It required them, for the first time in their lives, to acknowledge in writing what they owed. Harold signed it. His hand, this time, did not shake with triumph. It shook with something closer to shame. Claire and Daniel divorced quietly. She did not fight for the marriage, because she understood at last that the marriage had ended long before the convoy turned onto the street. It had ended in 1,000 dinners, where she looked at her plate. It had ended in a doorway where she said, "It's just a house." She took away from it, she told him on the last day they spoke, a single lesson she promised she would never unlearn, which was that love without the courage to stand beside someone is not love at all. It is only company. Daniel wished her well, and he meant it, and that was the most damning kindness of all. He kept none of the house, He did not want it. He had never wanted the house. He had wanted for 11 years to be seen by the people he sat across from at dinner, and when they finally saw him, he discovered he no longer needed them to. He moved into the corner apartment on the 14th floor, and he kept building things that hold other things up, and he learned slowly that the quiet certainty he had carried into that living room had never come from the deed to a building or the seal on a certificate. It had come from knowing, in the place where a person keeps the truth about themselves, exactly who he was, whether or not anyone at that table had ever bothered to ask. Now, let me leave you with the thing this story has always been about, underneath the convoy and the flags and the reversal of fortune. The Whitfields spent 11 years measuring a man by his suit, his profession, and his silence. And they were wrong about every inch of him, because they never once looked past the assumptions they arrived with. And Claire, who loved him, lost him not through cruelty, but through the smaller, more common failure of never asking who she was standing beside. True worth does not announce itself. It does not need to. It simply builds patiently in the dark, until the day the lights come on and everyone finally sees what was there the whole time. The loudest people in the room are almost never the strongest, and the person you overlook may be holding up more than you will ever know. So let me ask you this, and I really do want your answer in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by people who should have known you best, and what finally made them see you clearly? Tell me your story. Tell me where you were watching from. And if this one moved you, hit that like button and subscribe, because I have more stories about quiet people and loud reckonings. And I would love for you to be here when the next convoy turns onto the street.